I reckon language learning is already challenging on its own. So I think we should make use of some tools that make the whole process a bit easier. And thankfully, there are a lot of tools out there. And today we're gonna have a look at a major player. Some say it's a must-use tool, or at least a definitely fucking should-use tool, and that is Anki. Let's have a look. I'll start by explaining what Anki actually is in the first place. For the people who've never heard of it or have heard of it but don't really know what it is, I'll explain it here. Basically, Anki combines two things. It's a flashcard system, like paper flashcards, just digital, with spaced repetition. And that's where the name SRS, spaced repetition software, comes from. Let's break this down. The flashcard system is fairly simple. We're still working from a kind of basic flashcard basis. We have a front and a back of the card. But in contrast to paper flashcards, we have much more possibilities because it is digital, so we can put in audio files, embedded video, pictures, a whole lot of text that normally wouldn't fit on a paper flashcard itself, and many more things. So the possibilities, because it is digital, are pretty much endless, but we're still working from a front and back paper flashcard basis. Let's now have a look at the spaced repetition part of Anki. And you might come across a lot of fancy terminology or codes like SM2, SM3, SM6, SM18 or FSRS, and that isn't really important right now. And it might sound very complicated, but it's really not. The point of these spaced repetition algorithms is that the algorithm itself schedules the flashcards that you've created for you. So let's say, for example, you look at a flashcard for the first time and you got it right, then you press good and you will see that card in a short amount of time again, either 10 minutes or 15 minutes, whatever the algorithm is. And the point is, the more often you press good or the more often you pass the card, the bigger the interval gets to the next time you see the card again. And depending on the algorithm you use or the program uses, the different these kind of intervals become. But the point is, the algorithm schedules the cards for you depending on the button you press. Now, what's the whole point of spaced repetition? Why does it exist in the first place? And as far as I know, the history goes back to around 1885 to a German bloke called Ebbinghaus. And he, for the first time, described the forgetting curve. So when you learn a new piece of information, you forget it in a curve like this over time. So this curve describes the memory retention of a newly learned piece of information over time. And now the goal of spaced repetition is to interrupt this forgetting process. So when you're in the forgetting stage, you disrupt that curve by reviewing that piece of information again. And you do this again and again and again. And the studies show that for each time that you review that information again, the forgetting becomes slower and slower to the point where you can say that you've acquired the knowledge and it's probably not gonna leave your brain again. Now, this all sounds very cool and interesting, but how can we use that? How can we use Anki for Japanese learning? And that's what we're gonna have a look at now. And to start, when you've already been trying to research Anki a bit, you probably would have come across a lot of videos that love Anki or hate Anki. There's very polarizing views on the program, but in my opinion, Anki is just a tool that has its strengths and its weaknesses. And we should play to those strengths and we should avoid the weaknesses. And one general strength or weakness from Anki is this. Anki excels in this and struggles with this. And obviously that doesn't make any sense right now, but I'll explain it, so don't worry. The goal with Anki is to recall one main thing from the flashcards. So on the front, you have a specific question to a specific answer. And you should make those flashcards specific instead of trying to recall a huge concept that, for example, stems from one cue. Let's say, what is the function of the mitochondria? And then the back of the card is just a huge list of facts and concepts, and it's kind of a whole topic that you're trying to recall from one question. And that's not the best thing to do, at least not in Anki. And I've come up with two main reasons why. First, at the end of the card, you need to grade its difficulty. So you need to grade it if you got it right or got it wrong. And if you have a huge concept, like the mitochondria example, then you might have gotten the gist of it, maybe 60% of it right, but you were still missing the other 40%, which then the line of passing the card gets quite blurred, which is suboptimal, because then you have two choices. You can either grade the card as good, which then you will likely not be able to recall the 40% of the card again and again, or you can grade it not passed, which then might lead to you getting those 40%, but you need to kind of repeat the old 60% that you've already gotten right in the first place again and again, which then again is efficient again. And the second problem is that a very complex card like this takes a large amount of time per review, per card, which isn't optimal, because we all have a limited amount of time, and reviewing a card that takes 10 or 15 minutes one time, and then in 10 minutes again, and then in one day again, and in 3 days again, might be a bit inefficient. I just think that the timings, the algorithm, doesn't really fit like heavy conceptual based topics. And besides that, it's just challenging to kind of get through a lot of topics that take a lot of time, because then you end up like investing hours and hours every day into Anki, which probably isn't the goal. So in conclusion, keep the card simple, have the cue on the front side of the card or the question to ask for one specific aspect and not a whole concept. So having this last point in mind, one strength of Anki, the most common one, is learning vocabulary. And here's some things that I want you to keep in mind when learning vocabulary with Anki. And the first one is learn words from most common to least common. And there's one main reason for this. It avoids you from learning words that you never would have learned, that you don't need in the first place at all, as in useless words, or you avoid learning words that might be useful at some point but aren't useful yet. So if we take this kind of column as a representation of all the words you want to learn with your specific Japanese goals, and the top are the most common words and the bottom are the least common words, starting on the bottom with the least common is a huge mistake, because those bottom words have a low ROI, I like to say. The return of investment is very low. The return you get for the investment, the time you put in learning each card, isn't really big, because the words are super rare. So instead, you should start at the top, learn the most common words, because learning that one word just takes a little bit of time, but comes up in conversation or in native material again and again and again, which then means that your comprehension will go up a lot and you will progress faster, better. So you don't only get faster comprehension of native material, but you also complete this column much faster. Because when you're starting from the bottom up, from the least common to the most common up, then you won't be able to understand any Japanese material or have any conversations, even if you're like 50% done already. So start at the top, because that's the least amount of effort for the biggest rate of return. Good. Next thing. Create high quality cards. Now, what's a low quality or a high quality card? I'll give you two examples from one end and the other end of the spectrum. A really bad card would look like this. You have one Q on the front and the kind of goal on the back, just a translation. And ideally, you take this out of a huge random list of words, which then gives you zero context for each word. And not only do you have zero context for each word, but because the word isn't explained at all and it only comes in that list, the real Japanese meaning of that word isn't actually clear at all. And then to make the card as bad as possible, you ideally don't put any audio in, you don't put any pictures in, any pitch accent, or any example sentences. This is an example of a horrible card. Let's have a look at how to make this a lot better. So, ideally, you start with making the card personalized, so custom, from your immersive process. Which means you read a text or you watch a show and you come across a word you don't understand, and now you take this word and you make an Anki card out of it, which then automatically guarantees that you have a huge amount of context for that card, and the meaning in the context becomes much clearer as well. And now you can put some information on the back of the card, which is audio. Ideally, the original audio for the series you've been watching. And then on top, maybe a dictionary audio of either computer voice or ideally native who pronounces that word. Then you can put pitch accent and the sentence in which the vocabulary came in from the original series or text, and then pictures and maybe notes and explanations. And if you do that, I'm not saying this is the ultimate card, I'm sure you can get it better, but with this, compared to the other card, your memory retention goes up significantly, which is good. And then also you create more understanding for the word you're learning, which is very important, because if you kind of learn stuff by heart and you don't really understand the whole thing you're learning in the native language, then it almost becomes a waste of time. And you might think, creating a card like this looks like a lot of work. And you're right. And that brings us to the next step, which is Anki pitfalls. Things you should avoid when using Anki. Now, the first one directly links to the point before, is that creating high quality cards, or cards in general, can take and waste a lot of time. And we all have limited time. Let's say we have 5 hours per week that we devote to Japanese learning. And if you now follow advice to create high quality cards, but that takes you 4 hours a week, then that just quickly goes from being inefficient to being not worth it at all. Like, by that time, you're probably better off doing something else because you're wasting a lot of time. And the solution for this, which thank God there is a solution, is that there are programs that make this card creation process automatic from immersion, for example. The keywords here are subs to SRS or sentence mining, which I don't have a video on, but just type it into YouTube and I'm sure you will find great resources. Now, next pitfall is being too ambitious. And obviously you should be ambitious, but what I mean with that is being too ambitious with putting new cards into Anki. The concept you need to understand with the spaced repetition part of Anki, that each new card has a kind of tail of consequences, which can quickly learn to burn out because you don't realize that those cards are coming back to haunt you, so to say. So you risk either burnout when it becomes way too much, or the slightly less extreme version is it leads to super high review times that are so high that maybe you're wasting most of your time that you have per week on Anki instead of focusing on other productive things. So to avoid this, only do as many new cards as your personal schedule can handle. And here again, consistency is key. So I'm happier if you start with less cards per day or per week and then work your way up instead of starting super high and burning out and crashing and stopping learning entirely. Consistency is very important. Much more important than maybe 1 or 2 extra cards that day. And now, the next pitfall is creating low quality cards. This directly links to the point before, but I just wanted to drive home that if you're learning from very low quality cards, it's not just that efficiency drops again, but it might become so inefficient that it might not be worth doing at all. So high quality cards are very important because low quality cards can frankly just waste your time. So the big conclusion is that I'm not trying to scare you away from Anki, not at all. Anki is amazing, and in my opinion, you should definitely use it. But that's up to you. Just understand that Anki is a tool that has its strengths and its weaknesses. And when someone's trying to sell you Anki and it's the best thing for everything, take it with a grain of salt, and the same thing for someone who hates on Anki and every aspect of it. I think Anki is amazing. I think you should use it, but be aware of its strengths and its weaknesses. And then I think it will be a huge asset to you as a Japanese learner, or language learner in general, or maybe even learner in general. So, thanks for watching. I hope this helps, and stay consistent.